Today I'm going to tell you about our Global Oak Conservation Initiative, which is a program of our Global Tree Conservation Program that we're just kind of getting off the ground now. So it's kind of exciting, and I get to tell you about all of our lofty goals before we've actually tried to achieve anything. So hopefully this will be a great opportunity for us also to identify some potential partners and input from you, the world's oak experts. So just some quick background, but you've probably all heard this before. The Morton Arboretum was founded in 1922. We have over 1,700 acres, and our living collection consists of over 222,000 live plants from 4,300 taxa. And we have a long history of scientific research, and we've got a very robust research program now in a variety of different plant science, botanical, and horticultural research fields. But we also have a long history of conservation work. Over 5 decades of local and regional conservation efforts here at the Arboretum. We started very early in the conservation education world with May Watts here, who was wonderful educator and interpreter, writing books and even coming up with songs to educate children and adults about conservation. We do mapping of pre-settlement vegetation types, restoration of native plant communities and habitats. We're members of local, regional, and national conservation consortia and networks. We monitor rare species, and you'll have seen also some of our restoration and research programs that are happening on our prairie in the tour yesterday. We write native plant floras, and we work on the forest regeneration in the Chicago region that Bob Fahey told you about. So we have a very strong presence locally and in the Chicago region, but in the past decade or so, we really started to become very concerned that trees are under threat globally and that it was our institutional obligation to act. And this was really driven by our president, Jerry Donnelly, and our leadership team, and supported by our wonderful board of trustees, which has been so important to getting this program off the ground. So we renamed our research department the Science and Conservation Department and created 2 new positions, the Vice President of Science and Conservation, who is Nicole Cavender, and a tree conservation specialist role, which I currently hold. And all of this is to strengthen the Arboretum's role as a global leader in tree conservation. And we really think that with all of the growth and expansion we've done in the past couple of decades, that this is really our calling and it's our obligation. And so our mission for the Global Tree Conservation Program is to save trees from extinction through global collaborations. So to get this off the ground, we needed some partners and guidance on a global scale. And so we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. We followed existing frameworks and policies that are already in place through things like the Global Strategy for Plant Conservation, the North American Botanic Garden Strategy for Plant Conservation, and following lists and resources that are already available, like the World List of Threatened Trees. Then we teamed up with BGCI to support the Global Trees campaign. So we aligned our strategies and our goals for our tree conservation program with that of the Global Trees campaign and signed an MOU last year with Sarah Oldfield when she was then Secretary General of BGCI to say that the Morton Arboretum really wants to take a role in supporting this wonderful program. The Global Trees campaign is the only international conservation program dedicated to saving threatened tree species. And it's a joint program that's run by BGCI and FFI. And FFI we'll talk about in a little bit as well. That's Fauna and Flora International, and this is Botanic Gardens Conservation International, to add to Jerry's alphabet soup of, oak and conservation acronyms. So what did we do? We developed a conservation strategy that was focused and mission relevant. We wanted to stay true to our roots at the Morton Arboretum, so we leveraged our existing institutional strengths, scientific expertise, and our wonderful collections. And we're working across the Arboretum to streamline, coordinate, and integrate our research and conservation projects and programs. And so one of our biggest focal points for our global tree conservation program is oaks. And so that's what I'm going to tell you a little bit more about today. Why oaks? I'm sure I don't have to tell you. I am preaching to the choir. But as far as conservation goes, oaks are a keystone species in important ecosystems around the world. But oak-dominated ecosystems are in decline. As we've heard from Christina, acorns can't be seed banked. They're an exceptional species, so we have to work harder to preserve their germplasm long-term through some of the sophisticated methods that she is developing, and also through living collections, which is why botanical gardens and arboreta are so important. Oaks are also being plagued by new pests and diseases, which is exacerbated by climate change, and many oak species are threatened with extinction. More locally, oaks are very important to us here at the Morton Arboretum. They are iconic and important trees to us in this area. The state tree of Illinois is Quercus alba, the white oak, and in fact, an oak is on our logo here, with leaves representing our past on the ground, a growing tree, which is us right now, and an acorn on the right-hand side that represents our future. So the Arboretum is, as you know, an NAPCC Quercus multi-site collection holder. Hopefully everybody got to tour our oak collection yesterday. We have 127 taxa from over 3,500 accession trees, and that includes 5 IUCN red-listed species. We're restoring our oak woodlands, which you also got to see yesterday, and we have an existing strong network of oak experts, including everybody that's in this audience today, and a variety of research programs that are investigating oaks, like the wonderful work that Andrew Hipp is doing on oak systematics and phylogeny, and Bob Fahey's ecosystem recovery. So really, the Global Oak Conservation Initiative was kind of halfway there anyway, like by the time I got here, which is kind of nice. So we started by saying, how can we pull all the conservation elements out of our existing research programs? And really, there are conservation elements in all of the things that we were already doing, which is kind of nice. So we're sending a very consistent message to our visitors, to our donors, to our colleagues, to our collaborators, to everybody here, that we really want to champion oaks. And a lot of this research is supported by our new Center for Tree Science, which is a way of us to bring together a sort of consortium of tree science-focused experts to develop the research that's needed to understand oaks and trees in general. So this was one of our starting points, but one of the bigger flagship components of the Global Oak Conservation Initiative is this Global Trees Campaign project, a formal project under the Global Trees Campaign that we are developing right now with BGCI and FFI, so Fauna Flora International and Botanic Gardens Conservation International. And the idea is that we want to partner with other gardens, NGOs, universities, reserves, and one thing that I really should add, especially after talking to Mark Krautman, is industry, green industry and nurseries, which is so important, to basically bridge in situ and ex situ conservation efforts to ensure that no oaks go extinct in the wild. And we're going to do that through, and we have a couple focal points, obviously, are going to be Mexico and China, the two key centers of diversity for oaks, and the United States, where we have our strongest network, where we can really gain some support. So we're going to do this through 5 sort of key program areas, which are identifying and prioritizing the threatened oak species, improving and coordinating ex situ collections, supporting in situ conservation efforts, especially in these oak biodiversity hotspots, strengthening the global network of oak experts, and building capacity and awareness so that gardens and conservation practitioners generally can engage in very impactful and meaningful oak conservation work. The red list. I'm sure you're all sick of hearing about this by now. And I'm sure you're all experts at it, so I don't have to even explain what it is. So in order to know what we need to protect, we need to know what's threatened in the first place. So we are going to complete threat assessments for all of the world's oak species. And this is actually an update of an existing publication that Sarah Oldfield and a colleague wrote in 2007. It's now out of date and it needs to be updated with a more accurate species list. There were over 300 oak species that were previously not assessed in this publication. We need to add distribution maps, which is now a requirement of the IUCN in order to publish your threat assessments on their database. And we need to submit the assessments both from this publication and the new ones that we're going to be doing in the updates to the actual IUCN system so that they're searchable by everybody around the world on the IUCN website online. So just a summary of what the 2007 publication found. They evaluated 175 species and found that about a third of them were in one of these 3 threatened categories of critically endangered, or vulnerable. They also found that 33 species were data deficient and that there were over probably 300 species that weren't even evaluated. They never applied the criteria at all because there's just so little information out there. So this was a wonderful first start, and it's a great baseline for us to work with, but we have a lot more work to do. So the status of the project so far, I have 3 wonderful interns and a graduate student that have been working on this since January. We have compiled a species list. That was kind of one of the bigger challenges to start with, is just knowing which species are out there. There are many, many accepted names. So we compiled a list out of a variety of different resources and checklists and publications and authorities, and came up with about 350 really widely accepted undisputed names, 106 moderately disputed names, and 74 plus highly disputed names. So we're working with a list now of about 530 species. Eventually, we might just completely discount those ones and just go with this sort of 450 or so. This is open for debate. I would love input, especially from the taxonomy committee and from the oak experts in the room. So we started in the eastern United States with our assessment updates and really thorough effort, and we've moved west and now south into Mexico. And we have over 450 species completed with a preliminary threat assessment. So this includes data deficient, but these are going to be species that are now at least evaluated. They're not in that not evaluated category. So we've made a big improvement just there. We have 73 complete assessments, and 52 of them have already been accepted by the IUCN and are going to be published in their next update in November, which is really exciting. So just a quick breakdown of what our complete assessments include so far are basically 10% of the species in these 3 critically endangered, and vulnerable categories. So 4 species out of about 46 or 7, which is not surprising because we started in northern North America, and we have fewer threatened species there than there are down in the more tropical regions. So we expect this to rise. And in fact, when you have a look at what our preliminary threat assessments say, and this is based off of either quickly creating a map from the herbarium records that we have access to, or doing some preliminary research through other publications. If someone says very rare species isolated on a mountaintop in Guatemala, that is, we're going to say that's probably a threatened species just based on, these are very rough preliminary assessments. And it's looking like about, again, a third are threatened. Another third are probably not threatened, and then we have a pretty big chunk that are still going to be data deficient. We're going to dig a lot deeper. We're going to do these as complete, thorough assessments, but as a sort of relatively quick initial pass. What we're finding is consistent with the 2007 publication that we think about a third of all of the oak species are threatened with extinction. And I would not be surprised if that's probably a minimum estimate, and it's more than that because data deficient, we know kind of a lot about the world's biodiversity relatively, and if we don't have any information about these species yet, with all these wonderful people in this room working really hard to figure it out, I would imagine they're pretty rare. So that could be one take-home message for you, is that oaks are definitely threatened. So what do we do with this information? Well, we act. So these are now going through the 5 points that I talked about for the Global Oak Conservation Initiative, kind of strategic points. To improve and coordinate ex situ collections is one of our big goals. So this is an example of one of the projects we've already started. It's a Georgia oak, Quercus georgiana genetic diversity study that we are doing in collaboration with Chicago Botanic Garden. And we are looking at wild populations of Quercus georgiana, which are just these few patches here. And in fact, these South Carolina populations are probably inviable, if not completely gone. And we're going to compare, we have samples from all of those populations. We're going to compare the levels of genetic diversity that we see there with the levels of genetic diversity that we have in our ex situ collections. So the Georgianas that we have on our property here, as well as material from across the gardens in the United States. And the NAPCC gardens have all sent us their material. We have had several of you send us material from your gardens in Europe and elsewhere. And the idea is to understand how well do our collections capture the wild genetic diversity. Are we creating a living gene bank that is successfully, protecting this species outside of its natural range if these populations were to disappear? And this is actually a pilot study that we're developing it through a consortium of other gardens applying for an IMLS grant to really dig deeper into oaks and understand different types of oak species and collections, and if we can make a more educated and scientifically informed model for gardens to follow to develop their own living ex situ collections that have very good conservation value. We're also working to improve and coordinate ex situ collections through strengthening the conservation value of living collections. And that is a very horticulture and the collections department driven program. So Matt Lobdell, our curator, and Chris Bachtel, our VP, are working hard to eliminate trees of unknown provenance, increase the genetic diversity, increase the number of threatened species that we have in our collections. So Matt has been working very hard through the NAPCC and also through other means to go collecting. He's been on 2 trips already this year to get more oaks into our collection and more wild collected, genetically diverse trees. And it's important that we consider climate change when we do this because so this is an image from the University of Illinois through their climate change modeling research group that basically says that even under conservative emissions scenario models, that the state of Illinois by the year 2100 will have a climate a bit like Louisiana. So I don't know about you guys, but this is not Louisiana, right? Out here right now, this does not feel like Louisiana. So these are pretty drastic predictions for what our climate will look like in 100 years. But the Arboretum is turning 100 in a few years, and this is exactly what we need to be thinking about. What will our next 100 years hold? We're growing big old oak trees. We need to have a long game plan, so we need to be thinking about this sort of thing. So one of the species that Matt is going collecting for with several other collaborators of ours from other gardens is Quercus oglethorpensis, which actually has a range that's pretty consistent with some of these areas down here that may actually be what Chicago feels like in the next several decades. And this research and collecting is supported by a joint grant from the NAPCC and the U.S. Forest Service to support expanding the collections and the genetic diversity of our exceptional species in the NAPCC collections. So how Christina explained about the seed banking issue. So they're very interested in genetic preservation of exceptional species. So magnolia, cycads, oaks, other not seed bankable groups have received grants to do this type of research. And then the other really, probably even more important component of this project is supporting in situ conservation. Ultimately, our goal is for oaks to not go extinct in the wild. And so what we are working to do is engage local partners like gardens and NGOs in oak diversity hotspots to develop tailored conservation strategies for the targeted threatened species that we identify through the Red List process. And we already have several wonderful partners that we are working with and that we're developing these projects with, like FFI in China, BGCI, UNAM, the Vallarta Botanical Gardens, and University of Minnesota for efforts in Mexico and in Central America. And this is where we need help, and we would love other partners. So if you're a garden, if you run an NGO, if you have collaborators in any of these areas, if you are here in the United States and your garden is next door to a threatened population, let us know. We want to work with you. We want to find a way to help develop a really exciting in situ, ex situ, integrated conservation management strategy for your favorite threatened oak. And then we're working to strengthen the global network of oak experts. So things like the International Oak Society Conference here. You have been so helpful for everything that we have been working on here. To be able to stand in a room with all of you oak experts and, talk about things like ex situ collections and seed banking and horticultural practices that could be applied to conservation. This is the way that we are going to kind of gather this information together and disseminate it, make sure that we have impact. We're working very closely with the NAPCC through, for example, that U.S. Forest Service grant that I mentioned. We've also applied for funding to kind of dig a little bit deeper into the database of the NAPCC for the oak curatorial group and see if we can do a gap analysis for the threatened species in the United States and try to strengthen the networking of our collections and make sure that all of the different populations from the different threatened species are represented in our collections, because what we find for something like Quercus georgiana is that everybody has material from the type locality at Stone Mountain, Georgia, but very few gardens have material from some of those other satellite populations, which may hold some really interesting, unique alleles that we should be trying to protect. And then a shameless plug for another conference that we're hosting here in collaboration with the U.S. Forest Service, BGCI, and Chicago Botanic Garden is Gene Conservation of Tree Species, Banking on the Future, which will be in downtown Chicago in mid-May in 2016 with a field day and tour and banquet dinner here at the Morton Arboretum. So these are all ways that we are trying to support bringing people together so that we can do some more of this work. We're also working to build capacity and awareness for oak conservation. So the Oak Conservation Toolkit workshop that I hosted yesterday, gotcha, you all helped me put this together. This was really, really useful information, and this is exactly how we're getting a hold of some of these resources. So we want to be able to provide to people information like protocols and tools and experts and methods and people they can contact for all of these different ways that we can work to protect oaks. We're providing workshops and training through things like the red listing workshop that we did on Sunday and an upcoming workshop we're trying to develop in Mexico for early 2016. We also produce publications. This is a recent paper that came out in Oryx on strengthening the conservation value of ex situ tree collections, and another article in the BGCI journal about how botanical gardens can work through ArbNet, our network of arboreta, to support the Global Trees campaign. And at the highest level of accreditation through ArbNet level 4, it requires an engagement and the potential for collaboration with the Global Trees campaign in a conservation activity. And then we're building capacity and spreading awareness even within our own walls here at the Arboretum. This was last fall. Our wonderful Andrew Hipp right here took all of the staff members at the Morton Arboretum who are interested in learning how to identify oaks out into the collection and taught us how to do it. And there are people here from catering and finance, and they loved it. It was so great. And so we are spreading the word about oaks across all of the different levels and departments within our organization here so that people can go out and tell their neighbors and tell their friends. And it doesn't just have to be the scientists, and it doesn't have to just be the curators. It can be everybody. And we're building awareness with our visitors as well. So this is just a small sampling of all of the different oak-focused education events, botanical art, interpretation, Endangered Species Day, interpretation, whiskey dinner, that's always a hit. So is the wine tasting dinner. So, luckily oaks are good for that sort of general appeal. And I just also want to say a huge thank you to, here at the Arboretum, my wonderful interns. If Emily Beckman or Vildan Gorner ever come to you asking for a job, hire them. And wonderful, inspirational colleagues that help me learn about oaks and teach me every day. BGCI and FFI are partners for the Global Trees campaign, who, we couldn't do any of this without. Sarah Oldfield, Antonio, and Janine. The NAPCC Oak Curatorial Group, I think, and the International Oak Society are our two strongest networks for really driving this stuff forward. And the Morton Arboretum for all of your wonderful support in this program. And thanks for listening.